Hey folks, and welcome to Typology, the show in which we explore the mystery of the human personality through the lens of the Enneagram. I'm Anthony Skinner, producer of the show, and I'm really excited to have you join us today. It's a special day. We have a special guest with us, Joshua Dubois from Washington, D.C. He is CEO, author, and media commentator. He's one of our country's top voices on community partnerships, issues impacting African Americans, and religion in the public square. Joshua led the White House office in faith-based and neighborhood partnerships under President Obama. In the White House, he brought together community leaders from across the ideological spectrum to tackle some of the nation's biggest challenges. Joshua is now CEO of Gauge, a market research company that also leads value partnerships. Check that out, valuepartnerships.com. He is a commentator on CNN, and he is the author of the best-selling book, The President's Devotional, the daily readings that inspired President Obama. And he talks about that a bit in the show. I don't want to give too much away, but it's really, really interesting. So you're going to love this interview. He is an Enneagram 8, and it's really powerful to hear how he leads from the 8 perspective. So without any further ado, here is our guest, Joshua Dubois, and the host you love, Cron.
Josh Dubois, welcome to Typology.
Thanks for having me.
If I had a nickel for every person who told me you needed to come on our show, I'd be Jeff Bezos.
Well, then we can split up all that wealth and do some great things in the world. Then
That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, before we jump in the show, we were just talking before we hit record. Your life is absolutely crazy right now. Tell us why.
Yeah. So we, my wife and I, are blessed to have a new baby. Auden is 9 weeks old. We also have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. That is happening, of course, as everyone's life is happening in the middle of a pandemic. And so we switched to a home birth at the last minute and navigated all of that. And it's also happening. Much of my work, I run 2 companies. One is a consulting company and another is a market research firm. But it's all focused on helping a range of partners, private companies, foundations, nonprofits, navigate race and culture, and sometimes religion too. And this moment that we're in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, has certainly, brought the issues that we've been working on literally for years, for over a decade, going back to my time in government, to the forefront. And so we've been walking alongside a lot of great partners through that. So when you bring all that together, it means that if I sound delirious, it is because I am. but we're blessed to be in this crazy mix and having fun.
Well, we're delighted you're taking time to be on with us. Tell us how and when you first learned about the Enneagram and your type.
Yes. So I first learned about the Enneagram from my buddy Scott Buckout. Scott is, he worked for us he still works for us on our consulting company, and then we worked together in the White House. And he also is a pastor at a church in Northern Virginia. And so he sort of got me into the Enneagram. But part of it was through the lens of people in our company understanding each other better. And so, and I'm an 8. There's apparently, and I'm not an Enneagram expert, but I am an 8. Apparently there is a tension where there's some confusion around 8 or 3 and some misidentification there. And so I feel like I'm in the midst of that tension to some extent, but yeah, I'm an 8.
Okay. So I do a lot of work with companies. That's where most of my work is done.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, how has the Enneagram affected your team and your relationships in-house?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the Enneagram has allowed folks on our team to not just sort of jump into the task list for the day, the to-dos of the day, but instead to see each other as real human beings first, right? That it's that pause before interaction where you're reminded that this person has a tendency towards leadership, or a tendency to sort of shy away, a tendency to be assertive, or to not feel like their voice is heard. And you're able to kind of be more empathetic, to adapt to real people as a result of that. And so I think it just sort of makes us more empathetic and more human with one another.
So this might help you, because I know you've got this 3-8 tension going on. But for the newbies in our audience, 8s are called the challengers. They're the most energetic, assertive, at times notoriously blunt, at times confrontational, no-nonsense number on the Enneagram, whose go-to emotion is anger. It's sort of right there on the surface. It doesn't mean that they're always exploding and whatnot. It just means that it's the triad in which they live, right? The 8's unconscious motivation is to assert power and strength over the environment and other people in order to mask vulnerability and weakness. Now, the passion that drives the way that the 8 acts, thinks, and feels is lust, which is not necessarily in the sexual sense of the word. Lust means that they have a passion for excess in pretty much everything they do, right? They overeat, they overdrink, they overexercise, they overwork, they over everything, right? Too much is almost enough for an 8. And there's this need for constant stimulation and immediate engagement with people and the environment. So does that kind of describe you?
It does. It's funny. It's for me, it's the Enneagram and my number bracketed or held in check or stewarded by my faith, right? It describes me, and maybe this isn't a value judgment. I shouldn't say at my worst, right? But parts of those could feel like the worst. But it does feel like me. It doesn't feel like, I would say, I think there's a nuance of where you start versus where you end. And so, for example, I've learned lessons from some close people in my family, including some who are no longer here, that passed away, that were 8 all the way until the end, right? And learned how to manage the most potentially self-destructive parts of that 8-ness, and maybe amplify the best parts. And so I think the number is right. I think the nuance is so important in terms of how you shepherd those qualities.
Yes, and of course we know that personality is fluid and adaptive, and so in the course of a day, you could go from unhealthy to very healthy, and there's sort of this movement. It's not a static position. It's not like here's unhealthy and then one day you go to healthy and stay. There's always this dynamic kind of moving fluid sort of a situation, which I'm sure you're experiencing at the moment, given all that's happening, right? You're tired, you're stressed, which might make this thing really jump around, depending on the situation. My question is, before you worked for did you know your type before you worked for President Obama, or?
I did not. No.
Okay, so it was afterwards. Yeah. Okay, so tell me this: would having known your Enneagram type when you were working in the White House, would it have inspired you to approach your work differently, do you think?
Yeah, I think it would have allowed me to be a bit, honestly, bolder and more assertive in some ways. I was a pretty assertive person before, but I didn't embrace that as a strength. Now, for example, whether it's clients or partners and so forth, they pay me and our team for our unvarnished opinion, for my boldness, right? I've learned to trust my instincts, and also the accumulated sort of knowledge through trial and error that we've gathered over time. And now I speak up. I'm very clear. with my views. I think I questioned myself a lot more in those earlier years. And I think that if I had known sort of if I had known my type, perhaps I would have embraced that a little earlier. So yeah, that's what I would say.
No, it's great. So you do obviously have a pretty fascinating CV, right? Tell folks what you did at the White House and what you're doing now.
Sure. So I ran the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the White House. I worked for President Obama for years before that as well in his Senate office. But in the White House, I had a couple different roles. I had the portfolio related most closely to both race and religion, so all the easy stuff, right? And but helped to kind of navigate the fact of this person being the first African American president of the United States, and all of the both opportunities and challenges that brought, from criminal justice to protests in the street to the relationship with his former pastor and more. But then my regular job was I managed 13 federal agency faith-based offices whose role was to connect to local faith-based and nonprofit organizations and help them serve people. And so did that. And then finally had a role helping just personally helping President Obama kind of navigate his own faith. And I send him Devotional every morning and prayed with him and just sort of walked with him in good times and bad. And so those kind of three different distinct things: the race piece, the faith-based office itself, and then just more of that personal role. And now, so I run two companies. One is called Gauge. It's a market research firm focused specifically on influencers and experts. We have some mobile apps and a dashboard where people who know culture are telling us every day what's coming next and what matters most. And we give clients access to that through a visual dashboard of people who have wisdom. And so it's that tool is called Next Lab, and our company is Gauge. And then separately, I run a consulting firm that helps clients navigate some of those same issues, but less from a research point of view and more from actual activation. So Gauge and consulting firm is called Values Partnerships.
Great. So it's interesting to me as I was reading your resume that one of the jobs you had was to bring together community leaders from across the ideological spectrum to tackle some of the country's biggest challenges. And honestly, I have to tell you, when I read that, I said, this actually sounds like a great job for an Enneagram 9. This sounds like a peacemaker job, man, given their gift for seeing the merits of all points of view, for mediation, bringing people to consensus, whereas Enneagram 8s, maybe not in their best space, like on their bad days, typically are very confident about the rightness of their viewpoints. They tend to be either or thinkers. And as an 8 friend once told me, we're more steamrollers than diplomats, So was this role ever a challenge for an Enneagram 8?
Well, it's funny. I was most confident in setting the agenda. And sometimes that means like quite literally the agenda for a meeting, for a call. I have maybe this is part of my 8ness, but I do have a level of kind of directness and authority about here's the structure that this will follow. And then I can come back at the end and sort of wrap it all up with a level of directness. But in the middle of that structure, I think, I let people talk, let people express their views, and then try to find those synergies. And so I think my 8ness is applied in that space by creating the structure and by being very clear about, the start, the midpoint, and the end, and then what the next steps are from here. But in the middle of that structure, I think there was still a lot of room for people to weigh in, for views to come together, for dissenting voices to be heard. And so I think that's how I tried to find that balance.
Yeah, I wonder if you have a 9 wing.
I might.
You might.
Yeah.
Which is a really great combination. And it's also one that can create a lot of internal conflict for people because as we tell this joke about 8s with 9 wings all the time, that we know somebody who says, we have a friend who's a 8 with a 9, and he said, man, my 8 did something today. It's going to take forever for my 9 wing to fix. You know, it's like,
Great.
you know.
Yeah.
So, what was your most, if you can sort of think one pretty quickly, what was your most iconic 8 moment in the White House?
8 moment in the White House.
Good or not
No,
so good?
this is not a singular moment, but I had to, I was the youngest ever head of a White House office. I was 26 years old when I started that role. And no one knew how old I was. I literally would not tell anyone for obvious reasons. So I wanted to be able to them to see me for who I was rather than my age. But therefore, that meant that when I was going in to brief President Obama in the Oval Office, the President of the United States, I had to like barge in there like an 8. I had to really, be confident in myself and assertive and know who I was and what I had to say. And so that was, I think the 8-ness allowed me to suppress those other voices and to be a young African-American man in the middle of the Oval Office of the United States briefing the president as if I had been around for 50 or 60 years. And so I think that was one of those moments. I also think, I think that was kind of one of the more consistent times where the 8-ness showed up.
Yeah. Well, that's where it was pretty darn helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so every in my experience, organization and corporation I've ever worked with, right? When I walk in the door, pretty quickly I can pick up that it has its own cultural type or feel. Like it has its own type. In the aggregate, all these people working together create a type feel within the organization, and it's not necessarily the same as the type of the leader. Like people think, the CEO is an 8, therefore the feel of the company organization is 8 or it's 6 or it's 4, whatever the case may be. So if you had to guess, what type would you ascribe to the White House during the Obama years? Like, what did it feel like to you?
It's funny, and I'm seeing this now. I see this kind of in our company and others as well. I feel like sometimes when you have, and I don't know exactly what President Obama's type would be. It's probably 9-ish, I would say, but maybe there's some 8 part of him as well. But therefore, you almost the people around have to be more risk mitigating, right? They have to be more careful and to not leap out there as much with a full-throated voice. And so I guess that more of a question for you. What does that sound like? I mean, I think the culture would be one of not wanting to make a massive mistake because the stakes were so high. But then there were a couple people, the president included, who were empowered to go out there and to make mistakes, to have a leading role. But the environment around them had to be very safe, quite frankly. And
right.
What would that feel like to you?
Well, interestingly, and I've said this before, I think all the best presidents of the United States have been 9s.
Yeah, I think he's about a 9.
And I've heard people say, they speculate, and of course they speculate, they're just trading ignorances when they do this, right? But, so-and-so, Obama was a 3. I've had people tell me he was a 5 because he could be aloof. I've had people tell me, you know what I mean? Like I've heard they're all guessing out of ignorance. But I always sensed that Obama was a 9. I think for sure Ronald Reagan was a 9. There's just no question in my mind he was a 9. He was running around on a horse at Camp David while the rest of the country, he was, just doing his thing. They also give people a sense that they are being heard and listened to, and they feel like where they get into trouble is they're so good at listening and taking in the merits of everybody's point of view that everybody thinks that leader is actually agreeing with them. And then later on, when they make a decision that's not consistent with what 5 out of the 6 people at the table thought, they all thought like the leader lied to them somehow or misled them. And I don't know if that was the case. It was definitely the case with Bill Clinton.
Yeah. The unique thing is about Barack is that I think it was the case with Bill Clinton too. He really is listening. Like it's uncanny. We were in Iowa in 2007 and then early 2008, and then we'd go back, 3 years later for some event, and he'd be like, "Oh yeah, I remember you from the thing," and whatever, et cetera. So there's a level
Wow.
of memory and of specificity about human relationships that is definitely apparent. I think the best presidents, then take all of that back and then become very strategic, right? They're like, I heard all of this, but here are the 2 or 3 things, the 3 points of view that make the most sense and that need to carry the day. And here's the one I'm going to do. And so they bring it all back in and then create their own hierarchy and then make a decision on that basis. They're not swayed by anyone. Like they brought it all in, but it's not, they have a level of confidence in their own mind, experience, et cetera, to pick the right path based on what they've heard.
So you are describing a very healthy 9.
Yeah.
Like an unhealthy 9 takes in all those perspectives and then is paralyzed, or because they're afraid of conflict, won't land on a decision based on what they've heard, right? So what you're describing actually is a very integrated, healthy 9. And by the way, I always get laughed at for saying this, which is I also think Bill Clinton is a 9. And most people say, "Oh, no, he's a 3, and I'm like, he's a 9, man. There was such a conflict of avoidant sort of dimension to Clinton, and that I think didn't serve him well in certain situations, But again, like I said, I think most of our best presidents have been 9s because their attention is not so laser focused, it's diffuse. So they're taking in tons of information around them, right? And then if they can whittle it down because they're healthy and then apply it in a laser focused way, then what you've got is a real force of nature,
Yeah.
which is pretty great.
Yeah, in his book, The Dreams from My Father, it seems apparent that he has had this passion to see situations from all sides. And I just wonder if you being a 26-year-old in the Oval Office, if that did shape you like significantly with you being at 8 and having access to that 9 wing. I just wonder how much that affected you, seeing him most likely a 9, seeing from all sides, if that really affected you in your leadership.
Yeah, I think so. I do. I try to pay attention to the voice that's not speaking up. And I'm very cognizant of, like, if we're sitting around a table, like, that we haven't heard from that person, and I wonder why. Whether I call them out or not, or ask them to join or not, that's, I think it's a case by case question. But I try to take stock of the range of inputs in any space, and understand that breadth. I learned a lot from him. Part of it is, those 9 qualities. I think there's a core just kindness and decency too. That, I learned that when your schedule and your life and the demands get to a certain level, that does not excuse you from basic humanity, right? And I think there's sometimes this idea that if, like, you're the CEO of a multinational corporation or the president of the United States, that, like, you can be excused from treating the people in your life really well, and that's just that wasn't the case with him. And he wasn't perfect by any means. I could tell stories from the basketball court that would illustrate that, but in terms of he genuinely felt bad if he didn't, give his daughters enough time after dinner. Like, if he felt like he was too harsh in a meeting with someone, it would be something that sort of gnawed at him. Like, there was still a tenderness to his humanity. And again, by no means was he perfect. Is he perfect? But it was helpful for me to see that reaching a quote unquote sort of worldly pinnacle of success does not excuse you from the duties to be a good person to the people around you.
Yeah, it sounds like a real ironic tone was set, right, in that culture, which again would be very, very nine. So we often say in Enneagram world that if you're a male 8 in corporate America, you're really lionized, right? You're admired. But if you're a woman 8, you're labeled a bitch, right? Um, do you think Black male 8s have to confront their own set of challenges or cultural biases that white male 8s don't?
Oh my gosh. Yes, yes. And I can give you an example of that, and some advice that I got from a colleague, a mentor that was hugely helpful. So there was a time early in my tenure where I had a very legitimate substantive work dispute with another colleague. It was just one of those. We're working in the White House. People are going to have different views on things. People are going to have different tensions and so forth. And I expressed myself, and I'm not a very vehement person. I can't remember the last time I've yelled at anyone, right? And so, but I expressed myself with a lot of passion in this dispute, as I thought they did as well. And that person then went back to my supervisor and said that he felt I was being physically threatening to him, that he was concerned for his safety.
Wow.
And this was just devastating to me. Like, he would have never said that about like anyone else. I mean, like, these things, there's moments of tension in every hallway in the West Wing or in the executive office building every day. And I know, and even those around like knew, like, what is he talking about? But it was because of what that triggered in him. But it also then made me feel defensive and self-conscious, and like, who wants to, I'm the head of a major White House office, right? Who wants to have that conversation with your boss as if you're on the verge of getting suspended from your junior year in high school? Like, I mean, it was just very demoralizing and demeaning. And so it really bothered me for a time. And then I had a mentor, Michael Stratmanis, who gave me some phenomenal advice. He needs to be on this podcast. Michael is great. He was he was the mentor for all the junior staff and just a wonderful leader. Now he leads public engagement for the Obama Foundation. And Michael told me, he actually said, Joshua, stretch out your arm. He said, literally, just stretch out your arm. And I stretched it out. And he said, now imagine your arm is literally 5 feet longer than it actually is. Like, imagine you have this massive, gangly, like, insanely long arm. He said that is what, like, you're going to have to navigate these environments like as a Black man in this place. So what that means is, like, when you think you're just tapping the table, other people hear you banging the table.
Wow.
What it means is that, like, when you think you're patting somebody on the back, other people feel like thump on the back. And that's the challenge. That's where you got to, like, be able to manage that. But he said, but here's the power in it. When you need to clap your hands and get people's attention, and you have an outsized ability to do that as well. And that was hugely centering for me. It took this loss, this deficit, this this pain that I was feeling at the time, and made me realize that there was an asset and there was something positive about that as well.
We had another guest, a Black guest on the show, a man, and he said, it's really, and he was an 8. He said, it's really hard. He said, because in America, Black men are already perceived as angry. You know what I mean? Like, and he said, and I'm an 8. So I'm perceived as being double angry. And there was a certain, I laugh, but there was a real sense in him of frustration and even grief that this was kind of the difficulty that he found himself in,
And my wife taught me that too early on. And she's the most brilliant person I know. And her name is Michelle. And she, it was just very clear that, Joshua, like, you even in like verbal conflicts with her, and every relationship is going to have some tension. And I don't think we have any more than anyone else. But she's like, you may not know how you come off, but it can feel intimidating. And that messed with me. I never want to intimidate the person I, love more than anyone in the world. And so that helped me calibrate early on too, in addition to these White House experiences, that yes, I am an 8 and I need to be very careful about these things. And I actually genuinely don't, I think it's been like, a couple years since I got really angry about anything. And even when that happens, I think I manage that really well. I don't think, but it is something I'm very cognizant of as a Black man, as a husband, and certainly as someone in these work environments.
Yeah. So 8s are laser focused on issues of justice and fairness. That is just, an iconic feature of 8s. They want to know who has the power. Is it being used or correctly, or is it being misused? How does an 8C experience and feel about, because you're in a unique position this way, about the polarized, racially divided, socially riven America that we live in today? Like through the eyes of an 8, what's that like on the front lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it used to be, I think for a younger 8 or 8 who had kind of been the earliest wave of engaging with these issues, it would be wanting to jump in, start something new now, intervene in a particular moment. I think I'm a more strategic 8 now. Like I see the structures that contribute to injustice, and I see the long view. I've also had the blessing of spending a lot of time with a lot of elders. Joseph Lowry, who founded the SCLC with Dr. King, was my closest mentor and died a few months ago. C.T. Vivian, who was also a very close mentor, died this past week. And I see the long road that justice for them took, right? And so I think now as an 8, I don't just jump right in, but I think about, okay, I'm going to put this in place so that 5 years from now, we can have X amount raised so that we can achieve this goal on this issue or this candidate or whatever the case may be. And so I think it's more of a long, slow burn as an 8 than it was, when I was first starting off.
Yeah. I have a 29-year-old child who is she's an 8 with an 8 wing, right? She went to Middlebury. She speaks fluent Arabic. She's incredibly intelligent, very informed, a little left of Bernie, and a very engaged walk the talk activist, right? And I think you actually just answered this question, which is, what would you tell a young 8 like my daughter about how to best use or steward that 8 energy in the contemporary environment?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would not tell a young 8 to be anything other than a young 8. We need young 8s. Because otherwise we would be making those young 8s cynical, and we'd be telling them, nah, this stuff's not going to work. And, I think change comes at the tension of those who believe change can and must happen, and those who are dealing with the practical realities of change. If it's just the latter, nothing will ever happen. You'd have people say, well, we can't change this policy. This candidate will never work. This guy, his middle name is Hussein. So how could he ever be the president, right? And so if you only had those types of people and you never had people like your daughter who are pushing the envelope, then we would actually never achieve anything. So I would tell her, until you naturally move to a different place, in your idealism and the way that you see the world, then it sounds a little hokey, but you pursue what is in your heart to pursue, and will be better off as a result of that. So I wouldn't tell her to change a thing.
That's beautiful. Well, I want to talk just a little bit about faith here, because I think that's an appropriate topic given who you are, its role in your life, and how it was a critical feature of your work in the White House. You wrote the book, The President's Devotional, the daily reading that inspired President Obama. So we know that President Obama is an intellectually curious person. He's a voracious reader. I always loved that he loved Marilyn Robinson, which was a huge deal to me because I'm a huge fan. I want to know, how did you go about selecting the devotional meditations you shared with the president?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a lot of reading, a lot of, quite frankly, my girlfriend and then fiance, now my wife, allowed me to take Sundays and go to a little park by Washington National Airport that was right on the Potomac River. And there's a book of quotes from the late 1800s, and I'm going to mess up the name, and it's not right in front, but basically a book of burning, of curious words of burning writers. I want to say it's something along those lines, and it's kind of obscure quotations, and so I would go to that frequently. The format of these would often be a quote followed by my own a scripture followed by my own reflection, and then finally a prayer. And so I'm only writing the reflection and the prayer part, and then I'm pulling the other from different sources, either scriptural and biblical sources, or from a quote from someone else. So I just kind of cobble these pieces together. I would often think about what he's going through in a particular moment. And so if this is a time that was extremely busy, then, I might try to pull something from Wendell Berry about, finding a quiet spring to restore oneself. If it was a time where, I felt like he needed the level of boldness, then it would try to speak to that. I pulled a lot from musical traditions. And so there's a fair amount of Nina Simone that goes into these devotionals. So that was the format, but I pulled from all different kind of places.
Wow, fantastic. So, the Enneagram, well, first let me ask you this question. Let me talk about your faith for a second. Characterize your faith and maybe some of the great spiritual heroes, and maybe through the lens of an 8, that have deeply moved and affected your life.
Yeah, so I am both. I know I'm one of those odd people. I'm both a ardent progressive and very active in progressive politics and social justice causes, and a very much a Bible believing Christian. I'm a deputy campus pastor at my little church in DC, National Community Church, and although my political and policy views are progressive, my spirituality is, I believe that God speaks to me. I'm one of those odd people that I believe in, the move of the Spirit that kind of surrounds me, and I believe in the redemptive death and resurrection of Jesus. And so that's my faith tradition. And I shouldn't even say tradition. It's sort of my active lived experience every day. I grew up in a religious household, and then I left that for a very long time and found my own way back. And what was the second question? Sorry.
Well, I was just, who you're.
My spiritual giants are a little different. There's a guy named Warren Collins who pastored the church where I rediscovered my faith as I was wrapping up my time at Boston University, having, explored being an atheist and then kind of an agnostic, and then finally kind of coming back to faith, who has led a very small church of about 20 people for the last 20 years. And we don't know why it doesn't grow, but he has the purest approach to religion that I've ever seen. He preaches an unvarnished, direct word about the kingdom of God and how we should live our lives that continues to be refreshing for me. So he's a spiritual giant for me. Fannie Lou Hamer, the great activist in the civil rights movement, someone who didn't, I think she had a middle school education, but whose faith enabled such boldness and such courage and such, she was the definition of an 8. She didn't let any sort of self-doubt creep in, to the extent that, she was picking cotton in Mississippi, and then, a couple decades later, she's in the middle of the Democratic National Convention giving a speech about what America needs to do right now. So I think she's a spiritual giant for me as well. My giants are the friends I walk with, man. Dave Schmigdahl, from NCC, my buddy who leads our Lincoln location, and Heather Zimpel, and I mean, like, Eugene Schneeberg is my giant, man. Eugene was the best man at my wedding. He was a street worker for 8 years in Lynn, Massachusetts, working with former gang members and going with them to court and preaching the gospel, but also helping get them health insurance. And he's my accountability partner. We talk every Tuesday morning along with a small group of guys. And we just walk with each other through everything. So yeah, I guess I don't have giants in the big sense. I have them in kind of the everyday sense, the people that I lean on.
Well, I love that. And by the way, Mark Batterson's a friend. He's
awesome.
And
I love my pastor, man. He's awesome.
Yeah, he's been on our show. He's been on Typology. I think he's endorsed all 3 of my books.
That's great.
And so I have an affection for Mark, and I'm so glad that you're part of that community.
He married us. He married my wife and I, and he's been a mentor and a friend for years now. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, coming up on my last 2 questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so I asked this question of another guest recently. I said, if I gave you 10 minutes in the Oval Office or in front of Congress, what would you as an 8, or, probably this might come in sideways, but I'm thinking about this through the lens of the Enneagram. What would you want to say to the nation's leadership?
Man, that's a good question. I kind of want to scream, stop. I feel like
dude, we all want to scream, stop.
Of a massive reset, right? I feel like we're just talking around each other. And I don't want to minimize the differences. I think when you compare the far right to the extraordinarily progressive left, there are significant differences. But from an inch over from the far right and an inch over from the far left, all the way to the folks in the middle, there's actually just a ton of super common sense things that could really get done, right? Like, I think we all know that healthcare in this country just doesn't. I don't care what, there's lots of different approaches. We can all baseline that it just doesn't make sense, right? It feels very inefficient. The amount that we're paying feels inefficient. There's so many things about it just feel like they need to be optimized, and there seem to be some pretty clear solutions. We can agree that teachers should not be from a financial and salary perspective on the bottom rungs of the salaries that get paid in this country, right? We should value that more and value education more. In this moment, we should all be able to agree that, you reduce the prevalence of a pandemic by encouraging people to wear masks. We politicize so many things because it's in the incentive of those who are on the far right or far left to do so, but everyone else just gets lost. And I feel like, again, not to minimize the differences, there are some legitimate, important distinctions here. For example, I think that there need to be radical changes in the criminal justice system and policing, and there are those who may not think that is the case. But on a great many issues, there's more common ground than we give ourselves credit for, because the people in power are incentivized to divide us rather than unite us, and I just want them to stop. So that's what I would do.
First of all, I loved all the 8 energy that just came out when you did that. Did you feel it, Anthony?
Yeah, absolutely.
It was so beautiful, and justified, right? So it wasn't just beautiful; it was called for. It's interesting. I think our country used to be a 3 country. In other words, we were future oriented, right? And there was a certain hopefulness that we could accomplish more than we could imagine, right? And very future oriented. I think our country now has become kind of a counterphobic 6 culture, where it's based on fear and groupthink, which is a big feature of what happens when 6s get unhealthy. And I think the undercurrent is fear, right? Where where fear is being used, is weaponized and then used to manipulate the greater population, right? I mean, the whole current theme of, you're not going to be safe. If you live in the suburbs, you're not going to be safe if Joe Biden becomes president, right? Which seems to me to be really the undertone of that, of course, is quite racist, right? It's like, black folk are going to come into your neighborhood and they're going to, rob your homes. And there just seems to be the undercurrent of fear and terror, which never ends well historically. It just doesn't end well for us. So I appreciate your perspective. And I just feel like our country has, like, just the idea of making America great again. And, to me, from a spiritual perspective, again, I've said this before, I just think nostalgia is a sin.
Yeah. And if I can jump in there for a second, sorry to hop in, but I agree with you. I think one thing we may be missing is that the person who said that, Donald Trump, and the person who said, if you vote for Joe Biden, the suburbs are going to be overrun, basically, which is extremely racist, right? Or just yesterday, a couple days ago, noted on an interview of Fox News, like, they were talking about renaming the bases named after Confederate generals, military bases, and said, "What are you going to rename them to? Al Sharpton?" I mean, just blatantly racist. Like, he's trying to.
Yeah.
But what we're missing is that he has optimized his words and actions. Like, that is in his best interest. Like, he has a very narrow pathway to succeed right now. His leadership on COVID has been a disaster. Just we're not in a great place economically anymore. Clearly from the tweets, the tone, to the turnover in the White House and more, there's just so many data points that are just not positive for him. But it is, in fact, for him as an individual, the most strategic thing to do to play on that fear and to divide. The problem is, it's just terrible for everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. So like we I think sometimes we act like it's just a function of the times we're in. No, like, there's a guy who said this, and there's a small team around him who advanced this, both in the White House, people outside of the White House. There are individuals who have decided that it is in their interest, President Trump's interest, and the interest of a relatively narrow segment of the American population to divide us and to make us just drowned in hate. That is optimal for them. It's suboptimal for everybody else. And so I don't want it to feel like it's just this thing that's happening. It's happening because someone decided that it was in their best interest.
Yeah. Well, we know for sure he's not a 9.
Pretty sure.
Hey, man, tell us how people can learn more about what you're doing. Tell them about your socials, what you want them to know about what's happening.
So my Twitter is @Joshua Dubois. My companies are Gauge.ai. Our company is Gauge, and our website is Gauge.ai, and valuespartnerships.com. But you can always find me on Twitter @Joshua Dubois. So.
Can I just tell you, I hope we get to meet each other and become friends.
I would love that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
Man.
It sounds like our faith and political perspectives align, and it sounds like we would have so much to talk about and enjoy about one another. So my son went to boarding school outside of D.C. at Episcopal High School. I used to be there
that's awesome.
all the time. And but if it's okay with you, the next time I'm there, I'm going to reach out and say,
please drop me a line. Yeah, man. Even if we have to do it 6 feet apart, let's get together. Okay?
Let's do it. All right. Enneagram people, thank you for listening. This was a great conversation. Please remember the words of the great Oscar Wilde. Be yourself. Everybody else is already taken.